Okay. Welcome to everybody who has managed to join us. Unfortunately, a lot of ladies and I think Gus haven't been able to join us due to load shedding.
You go now.
Okay, I'm just going to mute everybody other than Judy, who I accidentally just muted. You can just unmute yourself, Judy. Cool. Okay. And I just done it again because it keeps changing. Oh my word. Okay. Most of you should know Judy. You're muted, Judy. You're muted. Sorry about that.
Okay.
A lot of you will remember Judy as our judge from the 2016 annual competition for poetry. And but for Peter, Judy is an awesome poet, awesome person who just recently released a new poetry book. And we're very glad to have you here.
Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you to Writers 2000 for inviting me. As I said to Megan, the mute button is always there. So if I start talking too long and going over time, Megan, feel free to just press the mute button. I'll get the hint, okay? So let's get going. I'm going to share the screen and I'll probably disappear. Right. Let's see. Can everybody see that?
Just give it a, there we go.
Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk about the gift of poetry. And as I said, thank you so much to Megan and to Writers 2000 for inviting me along to discuss my love of poetry. What we're going to do today, I just hope we don't have, there you are. Before we start, I just want to say, obviously you're all free to take notes as much as you want, but I will be sending Megan a copy of the slides as a PDF, and they will be distributed for those of you that want to make use of them. So let's get going. What we're going to look at is poetry. And as Vita Sackville-West, a famous British poet and part of the Bloomsbury Circle and lover of the very famous Virginia Woolf, said, prose is a poor thing, a poor, inadequate thing compared with poetry, which says so much more in shorter time. And I'm terribly sorry if I've hurt the feelings of any of the novelists, but poetry is my love. So that quote really meant something to me. So what are we going to look at today about poetry? We're going to have a short introduction. We're going to talk about loving the language. We're going to talk about the poetic vision. We're going to summarize things in a conclusion, and then I will just put in some recommended reading, quickly run you through my books where you can connect with me on social media. And then the best part of the afternoon will be the Q&A section. So going to the introduction, we have to ask ourselves, what is poetry? So there's many definitions of poetry, but most of these definitions agree that the best poems are something that is mysterious and or inexplicable. It's something different to the other types of literary genres. And poetry is unique because it challenges us by making us think differently. It makes us perceive in new ways. It makes us not take for granted what we think about the world in general. Good poetry, really good poetry, changes us in some way. If travel of the body is the best education, then poetry is like traveling for the mind. Because a poem creates an experience in the reader that cannot be reduced to anything else. That reader it's almost like a virtual experience for the reader. And every reading of the same poem, whether it's by the same reader reading the poem in a different time in a different space, or by a different reader, every time a poem is read, it becomes a unique experience. And so a poem exists, poetry exists to create that unique experience. It's as if the poet in the moment of writing is at one with the reader in the moment of reading, even if the poet and the reader are separated by centuries and continents. And that is the beauty of poetry, because the best poems create a bridge between time and place. I'd just like to read a short example to give you a little idea of what I'm talking about. So this is a modern poem, What Came to Me by Jane Kenyon. I took the last dusty piece of china out of the barrel. It was your gravy boat, with a hard brown drop of gravy still on the porcelain lip. I grieved for you then, as I never had before. Now, this is such a simple poem, and it's about such an ordinary thing. And and yet at the same time, it's so full of action and so full of emotion, and it crosses time and it crosses space. She doesn't tell us her feelings. She shows us her feelings. She doesn't say, I felt grief, I felt loss. She says, I grieved, which makes it, for the reader, it becomes an instant experience. It's not listening to somebody else talking about grief. It's actually experiencing the grief as if it's theirs. So this subtle yet powerful grief in the poem crosses time. This poem was written almost 30 years ago, and it crosses place and culture because it was written in America, and every culture, whether it's Japanese or South African or American or from Timbuktu, everybody grieves differently, and yet the emotion of grief is the same. And everybody, everywhere, handles at some point in their life, they have to handle a lost loved one's possessions. And that is why this poem is so good, because even though it's written in a Western world with a possession that is something uniquely Western, a gravy boat, whoever reads it can experience the grief as if it is their own. And that, I think, is what a good poem does. It brings the reader into the experience. So to answer the question, what is poetry? I suggest that poetry is a verbal construction created in the heart of the poet to engage a reader in a pure emotional experience through words that evoke the senses and trigger a mystical, mysterious act of discovery that widens both our vision and our heart. So if we know what poetry is, let's look now at what makes a poet. American poet May Sarton says that prose is earned by a writer, while poetry is gifted to the poet from powers beyond the poet's will. So I think what she means by that is that a poet must have the ability to make something ordinary and familiar, like a drop of old gravy dripping down a porcelain gravy bowl, seem extraordinary to the reader. And a poet, like a painter will take a brush stroke, and on a canvas, a simple stroke can create an image. And that's what poets need to do. They don't have the luxury of prose writers to add description and character and dialogue and all of those things. A poet has to keep it simple and create layers of meaning with those simple word strokes. So I collated, there's so many different definitions out there about what makes a poet that I found, in the words of pretty famous poets themselves, 6 essential qualities of what a poet is, of what makes a poet. So a poet must have the ability to let go of reality. Canadian poet and novelist Margaret Atwood says, "When I'm writing fiction, I'm more methodical, more organized, more rational. Writing poetry for me is a state of free float." A poet must be creative and curious. Austrian metaphysical poet Rainer Maria Rilke says, "If your daily life seems poor, do not blame it. Blame yourself that you are not poet enough to call forth its riches. For the creative soul, there is no poverty." A poet must be optimistic. From American poet Mark Strand, "A great many people seem to think writing poetry is worthwhile. even though it pays next to nothing and is not as widely read as it should be, and truer words have never been spoken. Canadian literary theorist Northrop Frye says that a poet must be detached.
Very good. Talking about poetry. She says it's just a single line has got leg. Can you give me a spoon?
Okay.
Wrong.
Um,
Listen to the recording.
okay. Megan, I think someone needs to be muted.
I've muted her. Don't worry, Judy. Sorry.
Okay, great. No problem. Okay, so as I was saying, the fourth characteristic of a poet is that a poet needs to be detached from his own time. Canadian literary theorist Northrop Frye says that the mark of a great poet is one who sees his own time clearly, but with a detachment that makes him communicable to other ages. I mean, the poet that immediately springs to mind is, of course, Shakespeare. Anybody who saw Baz Luhrmann's movie Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes, I think it was made in the 90s. I mean, the words were Shakespeare's own. It was 16th or 15th century English, Shakespearean English, but the setting and the characters were modern day LA ganglands, and it worked. And I mean, I remember at school, I saw Macbeth was put on as a Zulu, as a fight for power in a Zulu kingdom. The words were Shakespeare's, but the setting, the people, the costumes, everything. And that is what Northrop Frye means when he says that the poet has to be detached from the herd thinking. You have to look beyond what the current time is all about, and you have to connect to the universal. But contradicting that detachment, a poet must also have faith, trust, and a wild abandon. Poetry, more than any other literary genre, taps directly into the human heart. In that brilliant movie, Dead Poets Society, which I confess to seeing about 100 times and crying every time at the end, Robin Williams plays a controversial English teacher, John Keating. And he says to his students, we don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion. And then finally, a poet must be a master craftsperson. Anglo-American poet W.H. Auden believes that whatsoever else it may be, a poem is a verbal artifact which must be as skillfully and solidly constructed as a table or a motorcycle. And that brings us to the next section, which is language, because a major tool of the poetic craftsperson is loving the language and knowing how to use it. Now, I mentioned with Margaret Atwood that she said when she writes prose, it's more rational and intellectual. And I love this quote by George von Hardenberg, who was a German aristocrat, poet, author, mystic, and philosopher. He wrote under the pseudonym Novelist. And he said, poetry heals the wounds inflicted by reason. So we're going to, hopefully today, we're going to go through the tools and the skills that a poet can use to move beyond reason and go into the sort of mystical state that produces the great poems. So a poet is, before anything else, a person who is passionately in love with language. Does poetry have its own language? Of course, and that's what we're going to look at next. So almost every culture in history has some form of language and some form of poetry, whether that poetry is oral and or written. And when I talk about poetic language, I'm not specifically talking about English or Urdu or Zulu. Poetic language is the craft of learning to use your own home language, your own mother tongue, to create word art, to create poetry, by understanding what turns your ordinary everyday language into poetic language. And poetic language is the craft. It's it's a craft. And if you can learn it, you can create masterpieces. But to create those masterpieces, you need to know and to use the tools of the trade. And the first tool in the toolbox of a poet is the poetic language, which is very, very different from other language, because when you read a poem, when you listen to a poem, there's a cadence, there's a flow. And that's because the essence of poetic language is musical. And a very fascinating fact to me is the fact that in 2016, the modern songwriter, the pop singer, Dylan Thomas, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature. I mean, it's like such a paradox. How can a pop artist be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature? But I quote from his citation, and it makes such sense when you hear this. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature for having created a new poetic expression within the great American song tradition. And I think whether you agree or disagree with a pop artist being given the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think the importance of this award is the recognition it gives that poetry is different to other literary genres in that it is a musical language. Obviously, we have prose language. Now, prose can be lyrical at times, but to be musical for 20,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 words, it's unsustainable. You know, there will be moments of pure description where the cadence becomes slow and heavy. So the essence of prose language is that it's rational, it's reality-based. And yes, even sci-fi and fantasy novels are reality-based because they create a world that we can relate to. So it becomes real to us. Where poetic language is short and it's sparse and it simply soars, it doesn't have the space to create all these fancy things that take us away. I mean, even the longer poems like epic poetry, they have an overarching musicality that is absent in prose. And then the final type of language that we deal with in literary genre is your technical language. It's your how-to books, it's your travel books, it's your legal books, your memoirs, your medical, your academic, even advertising text is considered a technical language. And while these all have a very specialized writing skill set, the essence of technical language is functional and fact-based, while poetic language is visionary as well as musical. It flows from word to word, from line to line, from verse to verse. It may be factual in that it describes a tree, but it could mean it doesn't, you know, it could mean two or three other things as well. And that's what we're going to discuss now. So, you know, we ask ourselves a question, how do we as learner poets, how do we create this poetic flow? We learn to speak poetic language, and we learn to understand poetry's own subset of languages. We have three subsets of poetic language: literal and physical, figurative, and symbolic. So literal or physical language in poetry, if there's a tree, the poet describes the physical tree. There's a little bird with black feathers, and he describes that, and it's sitting chirping away, and he describes the sound, and he describes the sky's blue. The poet and the reader both ignore imagery, symbolism, and figurative language. The poem means exactly what it says. There's a tree and a bird singing. Then we have figurative language, which is opposite to literal language. This is the imaginative language that a poet uses to enrich the poem. I'm only going to give a few examples of everything because otherwise we'd be here for a long time. So figurative language relies on comparison devices, such as similes, he slithers like a snake, or metaphor, Juliet, my love, is the sun in my sky, or personification, death reaches out a cold hand. And the final subset of poetic language is the symbolic language. This is when the poet uses something to represent something else, to convey a hidden meaning or an abstract idea to the reader. So a real world example will be like, you know, every time we see those little red hearts, we know that it symbolizes the abstract concept of love. Symbolism, particularly in poetry, contains several layers of meanings. It gives depth to writing that cannot be expressed in a straightforward, literal, physical way. So this symbolism helps the poet convey his thoughts on multiple levels. We're going to spend about 1.5 minutes listening to John Keats's To Autumn, which is a great example of a multi-layered poem that uses all 3 levels of poetic language. I hope there's no technical gremlins here. I'm going to start Ode to Autumn by John Keats now.
Ode to Autumn by John Keats. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him.
Judy, can you turn the volume up? We're battling to hear it.
Okay.
Your volume's up.
Is the volume up?
Your volume is up there, but we still can't hear.
Let me try. Where's the volume?
Just want to see. Yeah, I don't know how you're going to. I know when you share, if you stop sharing and then reshare, but when you select to reshare, there should be an option to maybe include audio.
Oh gosh.
In Zoom.
In Zoom.
Yeah. If you stop sharing and then reshare your screen, there's sometimes usually
Okay, let me stop share. And then go down to share screen.
Yeah, and it should hopefully give you an option.
Oh, it says share sound. It says share sound, mono stereo, but it doesn't actually give me where I can increase the.
Okay, so but if you share sound, it should now play. I don't think you selected that the first time around.
No, hold control to select multiple windows. No. Okay, let's hope we get back in. Sorry, people. Technical idiots here.
Everyone.
Okay, let's try again. I'm going to take us back.
Ode to Autumn by John Keats.
Can you hear?
Better.
Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer hath o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swathe and all its twined flowers. And sometimes like a gleaner thou doth keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press, with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings, hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, while borrowed clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn, among the river sallows borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies.
Okay. Is everybody back? Can you all hear me, Megan?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So, sorry about the little glitch there, but Keats's genius, talking about language, Keats's genius lies in the three levels, in how he used the three different levels of language in this poem. So there's the literal physical level, a man walking in nature, enjoying the bucolic pastoral sights and sounds of the bees buzzing and the birds singing and looking at the, the leaves changing. That's the first level of the poem. It can be read and enjoyed simply on the literal physical level. But there's also the figurative level, where Keats personifies autumn as approaching death. And we need to remember that the poem was written in September 1819, when Keats, who was a young man at the time, he was only 24 when he wrote this poem, he already had serious TB. And in those days, TB was incurable, and he knew that he didn't have much living left to do. And in actual fact, he died in February 1821, less than 18 months after writing to autumn, and he was only 25. So the melancholy rhythm, that sort of slow cadence, that poignancy in the dying of the season, and the sort of trying to console himself by saying, thou hast thy music too, that adds a real depth of emotion using figurative language by personifying autumn as his approaching death. But it's on the symbolic level that Keats's genius really comes into play. But you need to know the historical context in which Keats wrote this poem to understand how he used autumn as a powerful symbol of a corrupt political system approaching the end of its season. So a month earlier, in August 1819, there was the Peterloo Massacre, where 18 people were killed and 700 were injured in a crowd of about 60 to 80,000 people in London, protesting the need for political reform around poor economic conditions and the lack of voting rights for the poor people in north of England. And then 3 weeks later, only 6 days before Keats wrote to autumn, he went back to London to witness the treason trial of Henry Hunt, who was a political activist involved in organizing the Peterloo protests. And Hunt was thought to be amongst Keats's literary friends and acquaintances, some of whom were known to be very radical thinkers. And then there's even another layer, because in addition, there's been some evidence to point to the fact that around the time of writing to autumn, Keats believed that his correspondence to his friends was being intercepted by government agents. So if you understand this historical context around how and when he wrote to autumn, you move beyond the physical and literal, you move beyond the figurative, and you move strongly into the symbolic, where autumn is this corrupt political system that is dying. So I would like to give you all some homework and ask that you go and find a copy, online or in one of your poetry books, and read to autumn as a political protest poem. For example, you'll find a whole new significance. For example, in the first stanza, you can see through the imagery the political fat cats getting fatter and fatter. In the second stanza, you can see the political fat cats getting complacent in their power and in their riches. And the third stanza, the whole tone of the poem shifts. The wailful choir of the small gnats mourn. That's the suffering of the small people, the little people, the masses. And that final line becomes so ominous, and gathering swallows twitter in the sky. It evokes the sense of a coming revolution, that the little people, the swallows, are gathering. And, every time I read this poem, it's no wonder that To Autumn is one of the poems that is most often included in general anthologies. But anyway, let me stop my fangirl rave right there. And before we run out of time, I want to look at the final tool in the Master Poet's Toolkit, which is technical skills. So part of loving the language is making poetry sing. And we do this by using and developing technical skills such as poetic devices, we use words, and we use form. So poetic devices, there's many experienced poets here, but for those of you who are just learning to love poetry, any basic search on the internet will provide reams and lists of poetic devices. I do have several good lists downloaded as PDF files. So in the question and answer session, if you want me to, then I can just add them to the email with the slides to Megan and she can distribute them. But the most important thing why we use poetic devices is because poetry mustn't be dull and heavy. It has to sing. And so poets will use poetic devices to create musicality in their words. For example, they'll make music by using alliteration. Peter Piper picked a pack of pickled peppers. By using onomatopoeia to make sound, the buzzing of the bees. So the words actually sound like what they're trying to describe. And there's many more of those. But poetic devices are also used to create rhythm. And I spelt that wrong, terribly sorry. Just seen a typing error. How do we create rhythm in poem? With repetition. You think of Robert Frost's poem. Listen to these words. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So the cadence of the lines and then the repetition of the two lines, it creates a sense of sleepiness. It creates that slowing, almost a lullaby rhythm that induces this feeling of wanting to sleep in the reader. Another way to create rhythm is internal rhyme. From The Raven, just listen to this. From The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. So that internal rhyme creates a beautiful rhythm to the poem. Again, there's many more devices that create rhythm, but we don't have the time to go through more of them. And then another use of poetic devices is that they add deeper meaning. For example, you have allusion. Thinking of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, I do not find the hanged man, fear death by water. Now, if you read that poem for the first time and you know about tarot cards, you would know exactly what that allusion is to. But if you don't know anything about tarot, you actually miss a deeper layer of meaning, because the hanged man and that whole scene with Madame Sosostris, the famous clairvoyant, is from the tarot cards. And water in the tarot cards symbolizes emotion. And if you think of who T.S. Eliot was and the time that he was brought up in, real men don't cry. It was a very formal time. You didn't show emotion. He was born British and then he went to America. And that allusion to the tarot cards and the meaning of Madame Sosostris gave that prediction. And he actually based the burial of the dead and the rest of the poem around that prediction in various ways by alluding to tarot. And then another way that you can add deeper meaning is by using paradox. From William Wordsworth, my heart leaps up when I behold. He talks about a child and a man on a beach. And he ends by saying, the child is the father of the man. And I mean, that's like such a paradox. How can the child be the father of the man? So it raises the reader's sort of thought processes. Does it mean that if I look at the child, I can see what he's going to become as a man? Or does it mean that the man must learn from the child's enjoyment of the beach to tap into his own inner child? And this, I think, is what these poetic devices do. They just add so much to a poem. And not only do we have poetic devices to add music to our poetry, but we also have words. And every single word in poetry counts. It's not like prose or technical writing where you can maybe get away with a couple of extra paragraphs and what have you. Every single word in your poetry must count. We have word choice and we have word order. So for word choice, we have to find the best word possible. We look at the connotation and we look at the denotation of the words, and we have to really understand the difference between the two. So the denotation is the literal meaning, the infinite blue sky. That's just it. It's the color blue. But the connotation is the indirect meaning. She woke feeling blue. That invokes a sense of melancholy or depression or feeling sad. And think of the word, getting back to Keats's Ode to Autumn. Sorry, I just love that poem. If you look at line 3 in the first stanza, he uses the word conspiring, and this shows how important the connotation of a word is. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless, etc., etc. Now, the denotation of conspiring, the literal meaning, is to act together. But the connotation of conspiring is that acting together is kind of secretive. It's behind closed doors. It's maybe illegal, or it's against somebody's wishes. We will conspire against her. And that suggests that there's going to be a negative outcome. Now, how do you think the tone, if Keats had used different connotations on some of the words, the tone of the poem would have been completely different. If he had said this, season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, uniting with him how to load and bless, etc., etc. Now, the denotation of uniting is exactly the same. It means to act together. So conspiring means to act together, and uniting means to act together. But the connotation of uniting means to come together. It means to create a union, while the connotation of conspiring has that secretive, negative sort of connotation. And that is why every single word is so important. The connotation of every word you use is so important in poetry. And while we're on that line 3, you think of the Peterloo Massacre, and he uses the word load, to load and bless. And the connotation of load can mean an abundance of something. But if you think of the political commentary he's making, and you think, imagine you take yourself into that square where there were 80,000 people and the cavalry came trotting out on their horses, and you can imagine them loading their guns and the of the guns. It puts a whole different meaning on the use of the word load. But anyway, so this small example just shows how vital it is in poetry to choose the best word possible to say what you want to say. Word order, we have to place the words in the best order to add impact and meaning. And also with words, less is more, because in poetry, what's left unsaid is as important an element of any poem as the actual words on the page, because it's the spaces between the words. It's those words that are left unsaid that actually allow the poem to frame the experience that lies beyond the words. It's those spaces that allow the reader to fill them, to create their own unique experience of the poem. It's worth reading Sipho Sempompla's poem, Words, Words, Words. We don't speak of tribal wars anymore. We say simple faction fights. There are no tribes around here, only nations. And this is a poem about the power of words and how word choice can alter reality. So we use words to create lines, and lines to create poetic form, which is the third way that we can make music and make our poetry sing. So we have two types of form. We have the formal verse. This follows the rules regarding stanza length, meter, and rhyme patterns. It's very strict. You can't deviate from it. It's things like sonnets, haikus, sestinas, blank verse, and many, many more. Then we have free verse, which is non-conforming, free from limitations of formal verse. I read an article recently about how literary publications are now looking mostly for free verse. They're not really interested in the more formal verse. And actually that made sense, because I mean, if you think about it, we're living in an era that is far less formal than previous times. So for me, free verse is far more suited to our times, because it allows the poet to shape the poem freely. And it evokes a sense of individual artistic expression rather than forcing the poet to work within a structure that comes from a different age. And the most perfect example of free verse is Grasshopper. I mean, when you look at this poem for the first time, you think, what on earth has that poet done? But if you look closely, you will see how E.E. Cummings uses the structural form to reinforce ideas and emotions. I've decoded it for those to save time. So if you look at it, you can see how he visualized the grasshopper leaping up in a flurry of confusion with legs and wings and antenna everywhere. And then as we look up now, you can see he's starting, I don't know if you can see my little arrow, but there's GR. He's starting to take shape because there's the hopper, there's a bit of the grass, gathering into the leaps, arriving. He's getting closer to taking form. Grass, all the small letters, GRASS, the small H acts as a bridge, and you read backwards hopper to become rearrangingly grasshopper. I mean, that is a beautiful example of a master poet, a master craftsman who just knows what to do, not only with words and form, but with every single letter is placed in a specific way to create a visual image. And also a sound image, because you can hear the, in the original undecoded poem, that messy sort of look creates the of the grasshopper leaping. So we now know how to make the language sing, but there are some poems, no matter how technically correct, that don't move one as much as another poem, which is perhaps not so technically correct. So what is the something special about some poems that's lacking in others? And the difference lies in the poet's eye, or the poetic vision. And we as poets need to learn, it's a real challenge to learn to open the poetic eye, because, and it's so important, because inner sight is a characteristic power of the poet. When a poet opens his poetic eye, he learns to look past the outer shell of something. He discovers its essence. He discovers its true meaning. It's almost like a poet needs an intuitive view of nature, man, the world, God, and how they interact on a deeper, almost mystical level. I mean, yes, intellect and emotion are absolutely essential in creating poems. You need to have the intellect to decide, this is the device I'm going to use. You need to feel the emotion because you want to know what effect you're trying to create. But at the end of the day, intellect and emotion are aids to the poetic eye. They're not the source of the poetic eye. And the source of the poetic eye is the poet's heart and soul. As the fox said to the little prince, here is my secret, a very simple secret. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. So we need to look at what the poetic vision isn't. It's not trying to observe and distinguish only objective truths and reality. It's not purely a critical, intellectual, or philosophical approach to writing poetry. It's not pragmatic, it's not utilitarian, and it is definitely not a commercialized vision. You cannot sit down to write a poem thinking, I wonder how much money I'm going to make, because then you're in for a big disappointment. And the poetic vision doesn't rely on external thought or form, but it really relies on the interaction between the poet's soul, what the inner essence of the poet sees, and what he also sees with his physical eyes, and it's how he or she brings those two together. As Dr. Zubhan Zain of the University of Australia says, poetry is art at its purest sense. It is never a commodity, but a breath of eternity. So if we know what poetic vision isn't, what is poetic vision? It is the ability to look into rather than at something. It brings us to a deeper level of awareness. The best way to describe this is to talk very briefly about Plato's theory of forms. So Plato, in his dialogues, he saw two realms, a spiritual and a physical. And the physical was the world that we interact with on every day, but Plato saw it as imperfect and not the real world. It was just a shadow or a vague image of what he saw as the ideal form existing in the spiritual world, which is the ultimate reality that exists beyond our physical world. That is where all abstract, perfect, unchanging concepts or ideals that transcend time and space, those are the ideals that can be seen in Shakespeare's time and understood in our time. And that is the true essence of the object that the poetic vision must see and find. So the poetic vision must see three realities. He must see the ultimate form of the spiritual realm of ideas, that's the vision. The poet must also see the imperfect idea of that pure essence, that is getting the idea for the poem. And then finally, he will see the distorted physical manifestation of the imperfect idea, that is the finished poem on paper. And how many times have we had this brilliant idea? We've thought we've got exactly the words, we sit down, we write it, and at the end we're so disappointed because it has turned out completely different to what we saw in our minds and in our hearts. And the great poets are the ones that are able to synthesize, they successfully process all their capacities, thought, feeling, soul images, intellectual analysis, technical skill. They bring it through the lens, the clear clarity of their poetic vision, and they create a finished poem that exists in a state of grace that transcends time and centuries and continents. And those, I think, if you can develop the technical skills and you can learn to write your poems from the point of your poetic vision, you will end up writing some terrific poetry. And in conclusion, we have to ask, is poetry relevant? I mean, poetry's been around since the Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates back to around 2000 BCE. So 4,000 years later, we're still reading and writing poetry. But today we live in such a rapidly changing world. I mean, more and more we're being isolated from our common humanity by technology, by COVID and the great vaccine debate, by economic and race and gender and all these other considerations. So I feel that we need poetry more in this era than we ever have in mankind's history, because poetry is a bridge between the light and the dark. Poetry is a bridge between the rational and the intuitive. And it provides an escape from the harsh reality of this imperfect world that we live in. And it offers us a beautiful ideal that can fill us with hope and connection across all these divisions that are busy isolating us. So it's not for us as poets to decide whether our work is relevant or not. Our job is to write the poems. Our job is to let each unique reader decide whether that poem has any relevance to them in that moment. Because as the great Chilean poet Pablo Neruda says, poetry doesn't belong to those who write it, but to those who need it. So why write poetry? Poetry doesn't pay, we can't find readers, it may appear irrelevant in a world that worships publication, material success, and neon-lit fame as the benchmark for literary success. My answer to this question is, why not write poetry? The hardy-dars in our gardens are not as lovely as the little Cape robins that flit around with their little red bests and chirp, but how boring our lives would be if we didn't wake up every morning to the cacophony of a flock of hardy-dars. So as Rainer Maria Rilke said, when the work of the eyes is done, go do the heart work on the images imprisoned within your soul. Write those poems. And while you're writing the poems, I hope you will also find time to read some of the books that I have put on my recommended list. You'll see some of them are quite old, but a lot of the modern how-to books tend to concentrate on the commercialization of poetry. And as you've probably gathered, that's not the platform that I sort of write from. So you will get this when you get the PDFs. These are my books. Megan did mention my latest book, The Dust of Hope. Here are poems that invite us to stop, to breathe, and to see the world around us from a new perspective, birthed within the center of our souls. Most of my books are available online. A couple of print copies are available at book dealers in the colony or the bookshop in Turkey in Cape Town, except Taxpayers' Rights, which I wrote with my late husband. That's available only from Juta's catalogue. This book is only available from Amazon because I've put it into the lending library there. And then finally, as I said, poetry doesn't pay, so I have to earn my living somehow. I do tarot consultations. You can connect with me. There's a bit on Wikipedia, my blog, Facebook. You can like my personal profile as a friend or my page. If you're interested in following my book reviews, join me as a friend on Goodreads or follow me as an author. I'm quite active on Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. I put up book trailers. And then, of course, there's the ubiquitous Twitter, which is everywhere and unescapable. And now we come to the best part, which is the question and answer session. So I'm going to open the screens. I think I'm going to stop screen sharing and open up. And I hope everybody heard everything after that little technical glitch in the middle.
Any questions for Judy?
Yes, I'd just like to say it's a wonderful talk, and the one thing that I really want to applaud you for was the space between the words. So important.
Yeah.
I've never heard anybody else say that.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I always go for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Duncan. Thank you. Thank you for your kind words.
I too found it very interesting, but I'm never going to make a poet. I realize. All right. I don't have the mentality. I'm straightforward, shall we say, honest, forthcoming. All right. I don't cover the words in things that sound good. I don't think it's ever going to be me, but it was nice and very interesting talking to a real poet or from a real poet.
Thank you, poet. Peter, it was a hard journey for me to realize that I was actually a poet, because I started out writing wanting to be a novelist, and I just could not find my feet there, and somehow or other I just drifted into poetry. So I think I do think that you have to have a certain sort of like personality to be a novelist, and you have to have a certain personality to be a poet. Because I mean, Margaret Atwood writes poetry, but her poetry isn't as good as her novels. Mm. And I mean, Margaret Atwood's novels are sort of society changing, but how many people know her poetry? Same as Louise Erdrich. I mean, I absolutely love Louise Erdrich's books. They're very lyrical, mystical books, because they're sort of very based in Native American culture. And I couldn't wait to read her poems, and I actually could not even connect to her poems. So I think it's not. I think it's perfectly okay for person A to only be able to write novels and person A can't write poems. I think it just comes back to every writer has a different set of skills. And as long as you can find your own voice, you know, go for it in that direction.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Pleasure.
I would like to know, who are your favorite poets?
E. Cummings, T.S. Eliot, Keats, the Romantics, all the English Romantics, but the latter. I prefer the second wave of English Romantics. Keats, Byron, Shelley, modern day poets. I've gone blank. Trying to think of some modern day poets. E. Cummings, T.S. Eliot, but they're not really modern. I am finding it difficult to find very, very modern poems today, you know, like right now in 2021. But I think that's just because poetry, you know, that may just be an age thing, because poetry is quite, I think it's quite political sometimes. And I'm finding a lot of the poems I can't, you know, a lot of it's gender related, and a lot of it discusses the politics of race, and they're all very young, and I can't, I mean, you can appreciate the technical side and the technical skill, you can appreciate that, but the content and the emotions is not something I can relate to. So my favorite poets do tend to be 1950s and earlier, and particularly, absolutely particularly the Romantic poets. I mean, I like Wordsworth and I like Coleridge, but I really like Keats, Shelley and Byron. They're my favorite. Oh, and Emily Dickinson. I love Emily Dickinson. Walt Whitman's nice. The metaphysical poets, Rainer Maria Rilke. The metaphysical poets are also beautiful. I really like them.
I think I would agree with you in some of the new poetry. I also tend to stick to the old stuff and enjoy reading the old stuff.
Yeah. Angela, part of me, part of what worries me about the new stuff is, sometimes I just feel there's a trend, there's a herd mentality. You take To Autumn. It was a real protest poem against the common thought. He was an aristocrat. And all the Romantics, all the second wave of the Romantics were for the common people. And they were all aristocrats writing in the voice for common people. Today, poetry, I don't know, this is just a personal thing, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but a lot of poetry today, to me, they see what society is thinking, and then they write to that. Those are the poets that are winning the awards. Those are the poets that are getting published. They're not writing poetry that's transcending the age. No. Like Shakespeare, like the Romantics. They've got so hooked on the actual issues of the age that they I would love in 500 years' time to see if any of those poets have stood the test of time. And again, I don't mean to denigrate the technical skills, all of that is there, they're brilliant. And there are some poems, despite my reservations, there are some poems that do move me, but they don't move me to the extent of the great poems. And I think it's because poetry today is not tapping into the collective unconscious. It's tapping into the herd, the feeling of what's happening in the herd. A lot of poetry today is, gender orientated. It's questioning identity, all of those kind of things, which obviously is very, very relevant for the age. I mean, I wouldn't like to be young today, but it's not poetry that I can read.
I agree with you on that. Thank you.
Showing my age, what can I say?
Thanks, two of us.
Any more? Yes, no.
I'd just like to say hello, Shirley. I'll answer your email tomorrow. Okay.
I'd just like to make another comment. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can, Duncan?
I've found I've written an awful lot more than I would have done otherwise over this last 18 months. It keeps me within the bounds of sanity, I think. Mm. And the headlines that have come out, various headlines, are sort of wonderful books or inspirations for a whole string of stuff. Just as an example, there was one which said the price of pineapples was going through the roof. Well, you couldn't let that go by. You've got to do something with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think particularly poetry, because poetry is very emotional, and I think it's quite a good escape, like a pressure cooker, that little valve thing, and creative writing as a whole, I think, and that's perhaps why there's been this explosion of, the self-publishing industry, and the term. I mean, I don't really like the term self-publishing because I prefer the term independent publishing, because you look at the music industry. And you look at the film industry, I mean, people pay for their own music to be made and they pay for their own films to be made, but it's called independent filmmaking and it's called independent music. But with publishing, we can't get rid of this term self-publishing, which has, getting back to the use of words, it has a slightly negative connotation. And I'm sad about that, because I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get everybody exploring their creative sides, especially at times like this, as Duncan was saying.
He's one of the lucky ones who've actually been able to write.
Really? Yeah, it's been tough times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Judy.
Yes.
think,
Hello,
you-
Thomas.
Yeah, thank you for giving me a deeper insight into poetry. I have avoided it. You know, I love Shakespeare, especially can we say, the spoken Shakespeare, because
Yes.
then you need a good reader, and a good reader makes it even better.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you've given me a much deeper insight, and it says that anybody can write poetry. It doesn't matter how good, or can we say trite, but you can write it.
Yes.
So thank you for that. That's been a very nice experience.
Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, Thomas. Thank you. I've really enjoyed my time preparing and being here this afternoon.
You've done a lot of preparation, that's for sure. Thank you very much for that.
No, it was an absolute pleasure. I was a little bit worried because, you know, there was all these little rabbit holes that I was disappearing down to, because I found this interesting fact and off I'd go down the rabbit hole, and I was thinking, I've only got 40 minutes. And I mean, I didn't make the 40 minutes. I'm sorry, Megan.
No,
I did run over time. But it's been an absolute pleasure, Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Or if you would rather finish off your meeting, unless there's more questions for me, it's up to you. I'm happy to stay, but if you want to, like, have
Okay.
you know, your private business meetings,
Thank
it's
you.
up to you.
I'll just want to add a comment. I really enjoyed your talk today. I found it very enlightening. And let's just quickly get it onto business, and hopefully we'll have a couple more questions. Okay, so monthly challenges. Unfortunately, Bergie was having a bit of a tough time and asked if we could find somebody to judge in her place with Gus, which I stepped up and said yes, I would. And thank you to Gus for his amazing comments. They were really helpful in my own judging. Gus, would you like to say anything, or can I carry on? Okay, we can't hear you, but okay. There was a couple of things, just check spelling. I see one of the entries spelled bizarre wrong. I'm also just a little bit more in terms of the usual grammar, punctuation, and all of that. But as I said to an email link to Gus, punctuation is not so much a thing lately. As I read an entire novel earlier this year, a Matt Haig novel, where there was no quotation marks whatsoever. It's a little disconcerting. Yeah. So the 65 words, the word was comeuppance, and third place was joint. It was joint. Third place was The Bully by Unafraid, which is Michael Quarters, and also joint Am I the Arsehole by Yes I Am, which is Angela Jones. Second place was Attractive Thieves by The Easy Target, that's Peter Roberts. And first place was Who Rules the Roost by Go Away, which goes to Nikki. Well done, Nikki. The 200 words, the phrase was It Was Bizarre. Third place goes to A Gleesome Threesome by An Astonished Loner, who is Peter Roberts. Second place goes to Bookworm by Disaparu, who is Nikki Gardner. And then first place was The Wrong Bride by The Wedding Planner, which is Angela Jones. Okay, well done to our winners. And next month's words are, the 65 word is frenzy. And the 200 words, well, 200 phrase is never look back. And if I remember correctly, the judges will be Bergie and Nikki. Do not forget that the October competition is due by midnight tonight. Entries to please be sent to me. The word is for 65 is scatterbrain, and the 200 phrase is I told you. Okay, and as we all know, next month is the AGM and prize giving. I'm sure you're all on tenterhooks as to who's going to win, especially considering we've had a lot of outside entries. And yeah, that's pretty much Shirley. You have
Yeah,
anything to say?
I just want to say that the prizes have been confirmed now. So Jack Swanepoel, who goes by the name Dr. Jack, who's one of the cartoonists in our country, will be supplying first prize for the children's fiction 4 to 7 years. He'll be drawing a picture to go with your story, which you can then use as a book cover.
Wow.
Yeah, very exciting. I actually
Yeah.
taught him in matric in 1983, and yeah, that gives my age away.
Yeah.
And we've remained friends over all these years, and I just thought that would be a wonderful. His drawings are amazing, so whoever wins first prize is going to be very happy.
Yeah.
And then All About Writing has come on board again to give prizes to the other categories. So all of that has been confirmed. And yeah, I've got the results in from one of the judges, and the other 3 will be
Soon, I
possibly
promise.
yours. No, you won't. You see, I
And
always
also-
need reminding about things. That's why I'm emailing all of you.
No, it's
I haven't
fine.
had chance to mention it to Shirley, but Judy has offered 2 of her books as prizes as well.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Judy. That's wonderful. Thank you very
Pleasure.
much.
Pleasure.
That's super.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're all on track at this stage, and yes, we are all waiting with bated breath to see. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Shirley. Okay, otherwise, that's pretty much all business-wise. I hope you're all well and dealing okay. As we have mentioned a couple of times, this last 18 months has been a little difficult. Lucky for Duncan to be able to write. I unfortunately have not been creative in over a year, other than my entries. So yeah, it's a bit difficult, but we'll get there. And yeah, anyone want to add anything? Any more questions for Judy? Okay. Well, that's all, folks. And we will
Thank
see you
you.
next month.
Thank you very much,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay
Bye.
well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Keep well. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.